There are stories you believe without hesitation, they aren't stitched together from formulas, and they don't reek of invention. And just as there are such stories, there are people whose words leave no room for doubt. Julian Jones was one of them. Perhaps not every reader will believe what I heard from him, but I do. I believe so deeply that the thought of joining his venture hasn't left me since, and I'd be ready to set off this very moment. We met at the Australian pavilion of the Panama-Pacific International Exposition. I was standing before a display of rare nuggets, unearthed from the goldfields of the Antipodes. It was hard to believe those knobby, shapeless lumps were mere replicas. Harder still to accept the figures listed for their weight and value. What these kangaroo hunters call a nugget, came a gravelly voice behind me as I examined the largest specimen. I turned and looked up into the pale blue eyes of Julian Jones. I had to look up, he stood at least 6'4". His sand-yellow hair was as faded and dull as his eyes. The sun seemed to have washed all color from him. His face bore the traces of a long-forgotten, fierce tan, now turned sallow. When he shifted his gaze from the display and looked at me, I noticed a strange expression in his eyes, the kind you see in someone straining to recall something of vital importance. "Don't like the nugget?" I asked. His distracted look sharpened, and he rumbled. "Don't like it? It's enormous." "Yes, it's impressive. And, judging by the display, it's authentic." I doubt the Australian government would. "Enormous," he cut me off, snorting with contempt. "The largest ever found," I began. "Ever found?" A spark lit his dull eyes. "Do you really think every chunk of gold ever discovered gets written up in newspapers and encyclopedias? Well, if it's not written about, we don't know it exists. And if the nugget's rare, or the person who found it prefers to remain anonymous—" "No, no," he interrupted. "I saw it with my own eyes. And as for blushing, I couldn't if I tried. The sun's baked it out of me. I'm a railroad man by trade, spent years in the tropics. My skin was the color of old mahogany, and people often mistook me for a blue-eyed Spaniard. That nugget, was it bigger than these, Mr. I prompted. Jones. Julian Jones." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope addressed to him in San Francisco, marked General Delivery. I handed him my card. "Pleasure to meet you, sir," he said, shaking my hand. His voice had the resonance of someone used to thunder or wide-open spaces. "I've heard of you, seen your portrait in the papers. And though I shouldn't say it, I will. Your articles on Mexico are nonsense. Utter nonsense. Calling Mexicans white, that's the same mistake all gringos make. They're not white. Not the Portuguese, not the Spaniards, not the Latinos, none of them. Yes, sir, they think differently, reason differently, act differently. Even their multiplication table's off. For us, 7 times 7 is 49. For them, something else entirely. What they call white is black. Say you're buying coffee, a pound or 10. How big was that nugget?" I pressed. "As big as the largest of these." "Bigger," he said calmly. "Bigger than all the ones in this ridiculous exhibit put together. Much bigger." He fell silent and studied me. "I see no reason not to talk to you about it. You've got a reputation for being trustworthy. From what I've read, you've seen your share of godforsaken places. I've been watching for someone who'd be willing to go with me." "You can trust me," I said. And so, beneath the cries of gulls wheeling over the lagoon, seated on a bench near the Palace of Fine Arts, I wrote down, word for word, what he told me. We agreed to meet again. But I'm getting ahead of myself. As we left the pavilion in search of a quieter spot to talk, A small woman, about 30, darted toward him with the flurry of a bird, just like the gulls overhead. Her face was faded, like that of a farmer's wife, and she clutched his arm with mechanical precision. "Running off, are you?" she shrieked. "Off in a hurry and forgot all about me." He introduced me. My name, of course, meant nothing to her. She gave me a cold, appraising look with her close-set, black, clever eyes glittering and restless, like a bird's. "Don't tell me you're planning to tell him about that shameless girl," she murmured with a plaintive note in her voice. "Hold on, Sarah, this is a serious conversation, you know that," he replied gently. "I've been searching for a reliable man for a long time, and now I've finally found one. Why shouldn't I tell him everything, just as it happened?" She said nothing, but her lips tightened into a thin line. Her gaze was fixed on the tower of precious stones with such grim intensity that not even the brightest ray of sunlight could have softened her expression. We strolled slowly toward the lagoon and settled on an empty bench, stretching out our legs with relief after all the walking. "All this just wears you out," she muttered defiantly. Two swans, having left the mirror-like surface of the water, stared at us. And when they finally realized we hadn't brought any pistachios, Jones turned his back to his companion almost theatrically and began. "Have you ever been to Ecuador? Here's my advice, don't go." Then again. "I take that back. Maybe we'll head there together, if you're willing to trust me and have the nerve for such a journey. Just imagine, a few years ago I made it there from Australia on a leaky coal freighter. 43 days at sea. The ship managed 7 knots an hour under the best conditions. North of New Zealand, we hit a 2-week storm, and near Pitcairn Island we spent 2 days repairing the engines. I wasn't crew on that ship, I'm a locomotive engineer. Met the skipper in New York and traveled with him to Guayaquil as his guest. Word had reached me that from there, across the Andes to Quito, American railroads paid handsomely. "So, Guayaquil. A fever-ridden hole," I interjected. Jones nodded. "Thomas Nast died of yellow fever after just a month there," I added. "He was a famous American cartoonist." "Never heard of him," Jones shrugged. "But he wasn't the first it took. Here's how I learned about it. The port's 60 miles from the river's mouth. How's the fever situation?" I asked the pilot who came aboard at dawn. "See that Hamburg ship over there," he said, pointing to a large vessel at anchor. "Captain and 14 crew all dead. The cook and 2 others are dying. That's all that's left." And he wasn't lying. At that time, yellow fever was killing 40 people a day in Guayaquil. But later I realized that was just the beginning. Bubonic plague, smallpox, dysentery, pneumonia all rampant. But the worst of all was the railroad. I'm not joking. For those who dared to ride it, it was more dangerous than any disease. No sooner had we dropped anchor than skippers from other ships came aboard to warn ours not to let anyone ashore unless they were looking to get rid of them. A boat came for me from the opposite bank, from Duran, the terminal station of the railway. The man aboard was so eager to reach our ship that he bounded up the gangway in 3 leaps. Once on deck, he didn't say a word. He leaned over the railing, shook his fist toward Duran, and shouted, "I beat you. I beat you." "Who'd you beat, friend?" I asked. "The railroad," he said, unbuckling his belt and pulling out a massive 44-inch Colt from under his coat. 3 months on contract, and I made it out alive. I was a conductor. That was the railroad I was about to work on. But even that was nothing compared to what he told me in the next 5 minutes. From Duran, the track climbs 12,000 feet up the slopes of Chimborazo, then drops 10,000 feet down to Quito on the other side of the range. It's so dangerous that trains don't run at night. Long-distance passengers disembark along the way and sleep in nearby towns, while the train waits for dawn. Each train carries a detachment of Ecuadorian soldiers for protection, and that's the most terrifying part. They're supposed to defend the crew, but when a fight breaks out, they grab their rifles and join the mob. And in case of a crash, the Spaniards' first cry is "Kill the gringo." It's in their blood. They slaughter the train crew and any surviving gringo passengers. I told you already, their arithmetic isn't like ours. And here's the devil of it, that very day I saw the conductor hadn't lied. It happened in Duran. I was assigned to drive trains on the first stretch, and the only direct train to Quito left once a day. On the day I arrived, around 4 o'clock, the boilers on the Governor Hancock exploded, and the ferry sank right at the docks 60 feet down. It was the boat that carried railway passengers to Guayaquil. A serious accident, but the aftermath was worse. By 4:30, packed trains began arriving. It was a holiday, and thousands of excursionists were returning from the mountains. A crowd, 5,000 strong, demanded to be ferried across. But it wasn't our fault the ferry was at the bottom of the river. According to Spanish arithmetic, though, we were to blame. "Kill the gringo," someone shouted. And the riot began. We barely escaped. I ran after the chief mechanic, carrying one of his boys, racing toward the locomotives, which were still under steam. During riots, the first thing you save is the engines. Without them, the railway dies. When we pulled out, 5 or 6 American wives and just as many children were curled up on the floor of the cab with us. And the Ecuadorian soldiers, who were supposed to protect us, fired at us no fewer than 1,000 rounds before we reached safety. We spent the night in the mountains and returned the next day to set things right. But that was easier said than done. Freight cars, passenger coaches, old switch engines, even the handcars had all been hurled from the docks onto the ferry Governor Hancock, now resting 60 feet below the surface. The crowd had torched the depot, set fire to the coal bunkers, and smashed the repair shops to pieces. On top of that, we had to bury 3 of our men who'd been killed in the chaos. And the heat was unbearable. Julian Jones fell silent and cast a glance at his wife's stern face. She stared ahead, unblinking. "I haven't forgotten about the Nugget," he said quietly, as if in self-defense. "And about that shameless hussy," muttered the small woman, as if addressing the marsh hens splashing in the lagoon. "I'm just getting to that part. You had no business being in that godforsaken country," she snapped, this time directly at him. "Oh come on, Sarah," he pleaded. "Who do you think I was doing it all for, if not for you?" Then, turning to me, he explained, "The risk was enormous, but the pay was good. In the best months, I made up to $500. And back in Nebraska, Sarah was waiting for me. We'd been engaged for 2 years already," she said, addressing the tower of precious stones. "Don't forget, there was a strike in Australia. I got blacklisted, came down with typhoid and who knows what else," he went on. "But on that railroad, I had luck. I knew men who died within a week of arriving from the States. If the disease didn't get them, the railroad did. And if not the railroad, the Spaniards. But me, I must have had fate on my side. Even when I sent a train off a 40-foot embankment, the fireman died. The conductor and the company inspector, he was on his way to Duran to meet his fiancée, had their heads cut off and mounted on stakes. I lay buried in a heap of coal, like a beetle, all day and night, until things quieted down. They thought I'd escaped into the forest. Yeah, I was lucky. The worst I ever had was a cold and a carbuncle. But the others, they dropped like flies, yellow fever, pneumonia, Spaniards, the railroad itself. I couldn't make friends. You'd get close to someone, and next thing you knew, they were gone. All except my fireman, Andrews. And even he lost his mind. From the start, the job suited me. I lived in Ecuador, rented a little adobe house with a tiled roof. I had no trouble with the Spaniards. Why not let them ride on the tender or the pilot plate? Throw them off? Never. I remembered well how Jack Gerris shoved two of them and muy pronto ended up at his own funeral. Speak English, snapped the small woman. Sarah can't stand it when I speak Spanish, he apologized. It gets on her nerves. I promised I wouldn't. Anyway, things were going smoothly. I was saving up to return to Nebraska and marry Sarah. And then came the story with Vana. That shameless creature, hissed Sarah. Stop it, Sarah, her giant of a husband said gently. I have to mention her, otherwise how can I tell you about the Nugget? One night, we were riding the locomotive, not a train, to Omoto, about 30 miles from Ecuador. My fireman was Seth Menace. I was training him to be an engineer, so I let him take the controls while I sat in his seat, thinking about Sarah. I'd just received a letter from her. As always, she asked me to come home and, as always, hinted at the dangers lurking for a bachelor in a land full of senoritas and fandangos. Lord, if only she'd seen them. Real scarecrows. Faces whitewashed like corpses, lips red as, well, like the crash victims I'd helped clear away. It was a beautiful April night, not a breath of wind. Moonlight spilled over the summit of Chimborazo. What a mountain! The railroad wraps around it at 12,000 feet, and the peak rises another 10,000 above that. While Seth was driving, I must have dozed off. Suddenly, he hit the brakes. I nearly flew out the window. What the hell, I began, but Seth cut me off. Now that's devilry. And I agreed. Standing on the tracks was an Indian girl. Believe me, Indians aren't Spaniards, not at all. Seth managed to stop the locomotive just 20 feet from her, and we'd been barreling downhill like madmen. But the girl, I noticed how Mrs. Julian Jones stiffened, though her gaze remained locked on the two marsh hens splashing in the lagoon. Shameless, she hissed. At the sound of her voice, Jones faltered for a moment, but then continued. She was tall, slender, graceful, you know the type. Long black hair flowing down her back. She stood there, arms outstretched, as if to stop the locomotive. She wore a light garment, fastened in front, not fabric, but a spotted, silky ocelot skin. And nothing else. Shameless, repeated Mrs. Jones, like a curse. But Julian Jones went on, as if he hadn't heard her. Not bad, I muttered to Seth as I jumped down onto the track. That's one hell of a way to stop a locomotive. I walked around the engine and approached the girl. And imagine this, her eyes were tightly shut. She was trembling so violently you could see it even in the moonlight. And she was barefoot. What happened? I asked, not particularly gently. She flinched, as if waking from a trance, and opened her eyes. Well, I'll be damned, enormous, black, and shining. She was, I'll tell you, a sight to behold. Shameless, hissed Sarah. At the sound of her voice, the marsh hens fluttered away in alarm. But Jones had already regained his composure, not a muscle in his face moved. Why did you stop the train? I asked her in Spanish. No reply. She looked at me, then at the huffing locomotive and suddenly burst into tears. Which, you'll agree, is not typical for an Indian girl. If you were hoping for a ride, I told her in the local dialect, which, they say, differs from proper Spanish, you'd have been crushed under the pilot plate, and my fireman would have had to scrape you off with a shovel. My Spanish is far from perfect, but I could tell she understood. She just shook her head and said nothing. Yes, she was a beauty. I cast a cautious glance at Mrs. Jones. She seemed to be watching me out of the corner of her eye and now muttered, "He wouldn't have taken her in if she'd been ugly, don't you think?" "Quiet, Sarah," Jones protested. "You're wrong. Let me finish the story." Then Seth chimed in, "So, what, we're just going to stand here till morning?" "Come on," I said to the girl. "Climb aboard. But next time, if you want a ride, don't wave your arms when the train's flying downhill." She followed me, but just as I turned to help her up, she was gone. I jumped back down. No trace. Around us, sheer cliffs, the track stretching for hundreds of yards, and not a soul in sight. And then, there she was, curled up like a ball right next to the pilot plate, so close I nearly stepped on her. If we'd moved, we would have crushed her instantly. It was all so senseless I couldn't figure out what she was trying to do. Maybe she wanted to end it all. I grabbed her by the arm, not too gently, and pulled her to her feet. She followed without resistance. A woman knows when a man isn't in the mood to joke. I glanced from this Goliath to his tiny wife with bird-like eyes and wondered if he'd ever shown her he wasn't joking. Seth put up a fuss, but I shoved her into the cab and sat her down beside me. "Seth was probably busy with the engine," Mrs. Jones remarked. "I was training him, you know that," Jones replied. "We made it to Omoto." She didn't say a word the whole way, and as soon as we stopped, she jumped down and vanished. Not a word. No thanks. And the next morning, when we were getting ready to head back to Ecuador with 10 flat cars loaded with rails, she was already waiting for us in the cab. And in daylight, she looked even more beautiful than she had at night. "Ah, so she liked you," Seth chuckled. And he was probably right. She stood there, watching us like a loyal dog caught stealing sausage, knowing she wouldn't be punished. "Get out," I told her. "Pronto." Sarah flinched at the Spanish word. Of course, I'd never had any interest in her. Mrs. Jones straightened. Her lips moved silently, but I knew exactly what word she'd just spoken. What annoyed me most, Jones continued, was Seth's teasing. "You'll never get rid of her now," he said. "You saved her life, not me," I snapped. "You did. She thinks it was you, so that's how it is," he insisted. "Now she's yours. That's the custom here, you know that." "Barbaric," Mrs. Jones interjected. And though her eyes were fixed on the tower of precious stones, I knew she wasn't talking about architecture. "She'll be your housekeeper," Seth smirked. I didn't argue, but I made him shovel coal so hard he didn't have time to talk. And when we reached the spot where I'd picked her up and stopped the train to let her off, she dropped to her knees, wrapped her arms around my legs, and sobbed, tears pouring onto my boots. What was I supposed to do? Mrs. Jones made a subtle gesture that told me she knew exactly what she would have done in my place. But as soon as we got to Ecuador, she vanished again. Just like before. Sarah doesn't believe me when I say I was relieved. But I was. I returned to my little adobe house and had a fine meal prepared by my cook. The old woman was half Spanish, half Indian. Her name was Paloma. "Well, Sarah, didn't I tell you she was ancient? More like a buzzard than a dove. I couldn't eat with her hovering around. But she kept the house in order and didn't waste a single coin. That day I slept like a king, and when I finally got up and walked into the kitchen, guess who I found there? That damned Indian girl. Acting as if she owned the place. Paloma, old as the hills, was crouched in front of her, rubbing her feet like the girl had rheumatism or something. But I'd seen her walk. She was fine. Meanwhile, Paloma was humming something strange and unintelligible, like a spell. Naturally, I gave her a good scolding. Sarah knows I don't tolerate young, unmarried women in my house. But it didn't help. The old woman stood up for Vana and declared that if the girl left, she'd leave too. Then she called me a fool and cursed me with words that don't even exist in English. You'd like Spanish, Sarah, it's got a flair for insults. And you'd probably like Paloma too. She was kind, despite having no teeth left, and her face could kill the appetite of even a seasoned sailor. I gave in. Had to. Paloma never explained why she was so protective of Vana, just mumbled something about needing her help, though truthfully, she didn't need a thing. Either way, Vana was quiet, unobtrusive. She stayed home, chatted with Paloma, helped around the house. But soon I noticed she was afraid of something. Every time one of my buddies dropped by for a drink or a game of Pedro, she'd get so scared it was painful to watch. I tried to get Paloma to tell me what was bothering her, but she'd just shake her head with a look that said she was expecting the devil himself to walk through the door. And then one day, Vana had a visitor. I'd just come back from a run and was spending time with her. You can't mistreat a girl who's settled in your house, even if she invited herself, when I noticed her eyes suddenly go wide with fear. There was a boy standing in the doorway, an Indian, like her, but younger and slighter. Vana led him into the kitchen, and from the look of it, their conversation was serious. He left after dark. He came again later, but I never saw him. When I got home, Paloma pressed a nugget into my hand, big, heavy, at least 2 pounds. Worth $500, easy. Paloma said Vana wanted me to accept it as payment for her keep. To keep peace in the house, I took it. Not long after, another guest arrived. We were sitting by the stove. He and the shameless one, muttered Mrs. Jones. And Paloma, Jones added quickly. He, his mistress, and his cook, all gathered by the stove, she corrected with emphasis. Yes, I won't deny it. Vana grew attached to me, he admitted, then added cautiously, too attached. I was indifferent to her. So, another one came. A tall, thin, silver-haired Indian elder with a nose like a hooked eagle's beak. He walked in without knocking. Vana let out a soft cry, half gasp, half moan, and dropped to her knees in front of me. She looked at me like a pleading doe, and at him like a creature about to be slaughtered. Then, for what felt like an eternity, they just stared at each other. Paloma spoke first, must have been in his language, because he answered. And I swear, he looked regal, proud. Paloma's knees were shaking, and she fawned over him like a nervous little dog. And all this in my house. I would have thrown him out, if he hadn't been so old. His words must have been as fierce as his gaze. He spat them like venom. Paloma whimpered and interrupted, then said something that seemed to work. His face softened. He gave me a quick glance and asked Vana a question. She lowered her head, blushed, and answered with a single word, nodding faintly. He turned and left. I suppose she said no. After that, whenever Vana saw me, she'd start trembling. She stayed in the kitchen all the time. Later, she began appearing in the main room again. Still skittish, but her huge eyes followed me constantly. Shameless, I heard clearly. But by then, both Julian Jones and I were used to it. To be honest, I did feel something toward her, not what Sarah keeps accusing me of. It wasn't Vana herself, it was the Nugget. If she could lead me to the source, I could say goodbye to the railroad and head back to Nebraska, to Sarah. But everything went sideways. Out of the blue, I got a letter from Wisconsin. My Aunt Eliza had died and left me her farm. I shouted with joy when I read it. Foolish joy. Soon enough, The courts and lawyers drained me dry, not a cent left. I'm still paying off the debts. But I didn't know that yet. I was ready to go home, to the promised land. Paloma fell ill, and Vana cried her eyes out. Don't go. Don't go, she kept repeating like a song. But I gave notice at work and sent a letter to Sarah. Isn't that right, Sarah? That evening, as Vana sat by the stove with a look of quiet despair, she finally found her voice. Don't go, she kept repeating, and Paloma echoed her softly. If you stay, Vana said, I'll show you the place where my brother found the nugget. It's too late, I replied, and explained why. Did you tell her I'm waiting for you in Nebraska? Asked Mrs. Jones in a cold, emotionless voice. Of course not, Sarah. Why would I upset a poor Indian girl like that? No, I didn't say a word. Vana and Paloma exchanged a few words in their native tongue, and then Vana said, if you stay, I'll show you the biggest nugget of all, the father of all nuggets. How big? I asked. As big as me. She laughed. Bigger than you. Much bigger. Come on, I said. There's no such thing. But she insisted she'd seen it with her own eyes, and Paloma backed her up. According to them, the nugget was worth millions. Paloma herself had never seen it, only heard of it. The secret hadn't been entrusted to her, she was a half-blood, after all. Julian Jones fell silent and let out a heavy sigh. They kept at me until I gave in. To the shameless one, snapped Mrs. Jones, like a startled bird. No, to the nugget. Aunt Eliza's farm had made me well off enough to quit the railroad, but not so rich that I could ignore the chance to strike it big. And I couldn't help believing those women. I already saw myself as the next Vanderbilt or Morgan. That's the kind of thoughts I had. I started pressing Vana for her secret. But she wouldn't budge. Come with me, she said. We'll be back in 2 or 3 weeks, carrying all the gold we can manage. We'll take a mule, I suggested. Maybe 2. No, that's impossible. And Paloma agreed, the Indians wouldn't let us live. We set out under the full moon, just the 2 of us. We traveled only at night, resting during the day. Vana wouldn't allow a fire, and I was desperate for coffee. We climbed the highest peaks of the Andes, and at one of the passes we were caught in a snowstorm. Vana knew every trail, and we didn't waste time, but the journey still took a week. I had a pocket compass, I memorized the direction. And the summit, you can't forget it. There's no other like it. I won't describe its shape now, but when we leave from Quito, I'll lead you straight to it. The climb was brutal. You can't reach it by night, we had to go by daylight. We reached the summit just after sunset. I could talk for hours about that final ascent, but I won't. The top was flat as a billiard table, about a 1/4 acre in size, and nearly bare of snow. Vana said the winds were so strong up there, they swept it clean. We were exhausted. I was dizzy and had to lie down. When the moon rose, I walked the perimeter. It didn't take long, but there was no sign of gold. I asked Vana. She just laughed and clapped her hands. But then altitude sickness hit me hard, and I sat down on a large boulder, waiting for it to pass. Enough, I said when I felt better. Quit fooling around. Tell me where the nugget is. It's closer to you now than I'll ever be, she replied, her eyes clouding over. You gringos are all the same. Gold is all you care about. A woman means nothing. I said nothing. It wasn't the moment to bring up Sarah. But Vana suddenly brightened, started laughing again, teasing me. Well, what do you think? Think about what? The nugget you're sitting on. I jumped up like I'd been burned. But beneath me was just an ordinary boulder. My heart sank. Either she'd lost her mind, or she was playing some cruel joke. It didn't make it any easier. She handed me a small axe and told me to strike the rock. I did once, twice, and each time, yellow chips flew off. I swear to all the saints, it was gold. The whole damned boulder. Jones suddenly stood tall, turned southward, and stretched out his arms. The gesture startled a swan that had been approaching us with peaceful, if opportunistic, intentions. It flapped away and collided with a stout old lady, who shrieked and dropped her bag of pistachios. Jones sat back down and continued. Gold, I tell you, solid gold. So pure and soft I could chip off piece after piece. It was coated in some kind of waterproof resin, lacquer, pitch, something like that. No wonder I mistook it for stone. 10 feet long, 5 feet high, tapering at both ends like an egg. Here, take a look. He pulled a leather case from his pocket, unwrapped a piece of waxed paper, and dropped a chunk of gold into my palm about the size of a $10 coin. One side was stained with a grayish film, paint or lacquer. I chipped it off the edge of that thing, Jones said, wrapping it back up and tucking it away. And it's a good thing I did. Because right behind me came a shout, more like a caw than a human voice. I turned around, and there he was. That same gaunt old man with the eagle's beak who once barged into our house. And with him, 30 Indians. All young. All strong. All ready. Vana collapsed to the ground and burst into tears, but I said to her, "Get up. Make peace with them, for my sake." "No, no," she cried. "This is death. Farewell, amigo." Mrs. Jones flinched, and her husband abruptly skipped over that part of the story. "Then stand up and fight beside me," I said. And she did. She stood and she fought. Up there, on the very crown of the earth, she clawed and bit with the fury of a wildcat. I didn't waste time either, armed only with a small axe and my long arms. But there were too many of them, and not a single rock to press my back against. Then came the blow to the head, and everything went black. "Here, feel this." Removing his hat, Julian Jones guided my fingers through his faded yellow hair. Beneath it, I felt a deep dent at least 3 inches long, sinking straight into the skull. When I came to, Vana was sprawled across the Nugget, and the old man with the eagle's beak was chanting something solemn over her, like he was performing a ritual. In his hand was a stone knife, thin, sharp, like a shard of obsidian, the kind they use for arrowheads. I couldn't move, held down, too weak to resist. What can I say? He killed her. And me. They didn't even consider me worthy of dying on their sacred summit. They just threw me off, like carrion. But even the vultures didn't get me. I still see the moonlight glinting off the snowy peaks as I fell. Yes, sir, I should have died from a 500-foot drop, but I didn't. I landed in a deep snowdrift wedged in a crevice. When I came to, must have been hours later, because it was broad daylight, I was lying in a hollow carved by meltwater trickling down from the ledge. The cliff loomed directly above the spot where I'd landed. A few feet to either side, and I'd have been finished. I survived by sheer luck. But the price was steep. It took more than 2 years before I began to grasp what had happened to me. All I remembered was my name, Julian Jones, that I'd been blacklisted during a strike, and that I'd married Sarah after returning home. Everything else was a blank. Whenever Sarah tried to talk about it, I'd get splitting headaches. Something was wrong with my head, and I knew it. One night, on her father's farm in Nebraska, I was sitting on the porch under the moonlight. Sarah came out and placed a piece of gold in my hand. She must have just found it in the torn lining of the suitcase I'd brought back from Ecuador. And I hadn't remembered being in Ecuador or Australia for 2 whole years. I turned the fragment over in my hands, trying to recall where it came from. And then, something cracked inside me, like glass breaking. I saw Vana again, stretched across the Nugget, and the old man with the knife raised above her. Everything that had happened from the moment I left Nebraska to the day I crawled out of that snowy pit came flooding back. And everything after that gone. When Sarah told me I was her husband, I refused to believe her. She had to gather the whole family and the priest who'd married us to convince me. Later, I wrote to Seth Menace. The railroad hadn't claimed him yet, and he helped me piece things together. I'll show you his letters, they're in my hotel room. He wrote that one day, during a run, I crawled onto the tracks. Couldn't stand, just crawled. At first, he thought I was a calf or a big dog. There was nothing human left in you, he wrote. You didn't recognize me or anyone. By his estimate, he found me about 10 days after I'd been thrown from the summit. I don't know what I ate, maybe nothing at all. Then in Quito, the doctors and Paloma nursed me back to life. She must have been the one who slipped that gold into my suitcase. When they realized I'd lost my memory, the railroad company sent me home. That's what Seth wrote. I don't remember a thing. But Sarah does. She corresponded with the company before they put me on the ship. Mrs. Jones nodded, sighed, and made it clear she was eager to leave. Since then, I haven't been able to work, Jones continued. All I think about is how to get back to that Nugget. Sarah has money, but she won't give me a penny. He's not going back there, she cut in sharply. But Sarah, Vana's gone. You know that, Julian tried to reason. I don't know anything, and I don't want to, she said firmly. All I know is that country's no place for a married man. Her lips pressed together, and she stared absently toward the lagoon, where the sunset glowed red. I looked at her face, pale, round, with delicate features, and knew she wouldn't be persuaded. How do you explain all that gold up there? I asked Jones. Did a meteor fall from the sky? Not at all, he said, shaking his head. The Indians brought it there. To that altitude? That massive, heavy boulder? I asked, astonished. It's simple, he said with a grin. I puzzled over it for ages after my memory came back. How the hell could that Nugget? I kept asking myself. Hours of guessing. And when I figured it out, I felt like a complete fool. It was so obvious. He paused, then said, They didn't haul it up. But you said they brought it. Yes and no, he replied with a mysterious smile. Of course they didn't drag the whole thing up the mountain. They carried it, piece by piece. He waited until he saw that I understood. And then, of course, all the gold was melted down, smelted, fused, and cast into a single colossal ingot. You probably know that the first Spaniards who came to those lands under the command of a certain Pizarro were not conquerors, but plunderers and violators. They swept through the country like a plague, slaughtering the natives like livestock. And the natives, for their part, possessed an astonishing wealth of gold. From what the Spaniards failed to seize, the surviving tribes forged one immense bar and hid it atop a mountain. That gold is waiting for me, and for you, if you dare to go after it. But it was here, by the lagoon in front of the Palace of Fine Arts, that my acquaintance with Julian Jones came to an end. Having secured my agreement to finance his expedition, he promised to visit me at my hotel the next morning, bringing letters from Seth Menace and the railroad company so we could finalize everything. But he never came. That evening, I called his hotel. The clerk informed me that Mr. Julian Jones and his wife had left earlier that day, taking all their luggage with them. Had Mrs. Jones spirited him away and hidden him somewhere in Nebraska? I remember, as we said goodbye, there was something in her smile, a trace of sly satisfaction, a quiet triumph like the Mona Lisa, only with a sharper edge of irony.